Welcome to the channel Litany of Shadows. Today we're going back to 1862, to the incredible story of two black twins, labeled gifted after a series of tests left even experienced observers without answers. But what made them famous wasn't just their ability. It was the impossible secret hidden behind the results, something that was never meant to be recorded. This is a difficult and intense story, so take a breath and listen closely. Before we begin, subscribe and tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your support helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. On the morning of September 14th, 1862, in the small fishing village called Marblehead on the coast of Massachusetts, two black children sat across from a white doctor who had traveled nearly 40 miles from Boston just to see them. The doctor's name was Nathaniel Warren. He was 53 years old and had spent his entire career studying the human mind at Harvard Medical School. He had examined hundreds of patients. He had published papers in medical journals across America and Europe. He had seen things that most people would never believe, but he had never seen anything like the Carter twins. The children were 8 years old. Their names were Elijah and Ruth. They sat perfectly still in their wooden chairs, their hands folded in their laps, their dark eyes watching the doctor with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. They did not fidget. They did not look away. They simply watched as if they were the ones conducting the examination. Dr. Warren opened his leather bag and removed a series of cards. Each card contained a different mathematical problem. He had designed these cards himself, arranging them in order of increasing difficulty. The first cards contained simple addition. The final cards contained calculations that most university professors would struggle to complete without pen and paper. He handed the first card to the boy Elijah. "Tell me the answer," Dr. Warren said. Elijah glanced at the card for perhaps half a second. 23, he said. The answer was correct. Dr. Warren handed him the second card. Elijah answered before the doctor's hand had fully withdrawn. 57. Correct again. They continued through the cards one after another, the problems growing more complex with each turn. Addition became subtraction. Subtraction became multiplication. Multiplication became division. Division became problems involving multiple operations and multiple steps. Elijah answered every single one. He never paused. He never hesitated. He never made a single error. When they reached the final card, a problem that Dr. Warren himself had needed nearly 3 minutes to solve when he created it, Elijah looked at the numbers for perhaps 2 seconds. 439, he said. Dr. Warren stared at the boy. He checked his answer key. He checked it again. "That is correct," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then he turned to the girl, Ruth, and removed a different set of materials from his bag. These were not mathematical problems. These were pages of text copied from books that Dr. Warren had selected specifically because they would be unfamiliar to any child. One page was from a medical textbook written in Latin. Another was from a legal document filled with archaic terminology. A third was from a philosophical treatise that used vocabulary far beyond what any 8-year-old could be expected to understand. He handed the Latin text to Ruth. "Read this," he said. Ruth looked at the page. She did not know Latin. She had never studied Latin. She had never even seen Latin text before this moment. But something happened as she looked at the words. She began to sound them out, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. Her pronunciation was not perfect, but it was recognizable. And more remarkably, after she finished reading each sentence aloud, she paused and offered a guess about what the sentence might mean based on the patterns she was observing in the words. Several of her guesses were correct. Dr. Warren sat back in his chair. His hands were trembling. In 30 years of medical practice, He had never witnessed anything like this. He had heard stories of children with extraordinary mental abilities, but he had always dismissed them as exaggerations or hoaxes. This was neither. He looked at the twins' mother, a woman named Sarah Carter, who stood in the corner of the small room, watching everything with an expression that mixed pride with fear. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "how long have your children been able to do these things?" Sarah Carter was 31 years old. She had been born free in Massachusetts, the daughter of a black sailor and a Native American woman. She had worked as a domestic servant for most of her life, cleaning houses and washing clothes for white families who paid her barely enough to survive. She had known that her children were different since they were 3 years old. That was when Elijah had begun counting everything he saw, adding and multiplying numbers that he encountered in daily life, calculating sums that Sarah herself could not verify. That was when Ruth had begun memorizing entire books after hearing them read aloud just once, reciting passages word for word weeks or months later. Sarah had tried to hide her children's abilities. She understood, in a way that no white person could fully understand, how dangerous it was for black children to appear too intelligent in America in 1862. The country was at war. The Civil War had begun in April of 1861, and now, 18 months later, the fighting showed no signs of ending. President Abraham Lincoln had not yet issued his Emancipation Proclamation. In the southern states, 4 million black people remained enslaved. In the northern states, free black people lived in a precarious position, tolerated but not accepted, free but not equal. A black child who could read was dangerous. A black child who could outthink white adults was unthinkable. Sarah had kept her children's abilities secret for 5 years. She had told them, again and again, that they must never show what they could do. They must pretend to be ordinary. They must hide their gifts, but secrets have a way of escaping. 3 weeks before Dr. Warren's visit, a white merchant named Thomas Aldridge had come to Sarah's small house to deliver a shipment of fabric that she had ordered for her sewing work. While Sarah was in the back room counting her coins to pay him, the merchant had noticed Elijah sitting at the kitchen table staring at a newspaper that someone had left behind. The merchant had laughed. "Can you even read that, boy?" he had asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Elijah had looked up at him. "Yes," he had said. "And there is an error in the 3rd paragraph." The reporter wrote that the Union forces captured 300 Confederate soldiers at the Battle of Antietam. But if you calculate based on the numbers given earlier in the article, the correct figure should be 347. Thomas Aldridge had stared at the boy for a long moment. Then he had picked up the newspaper and read the 3rd paragraph himself. He had done the calculations. The boy was right. The merchant had left the house without another word, but within days the story had spread through Marblehead. The Black Widow's children could read. The Black Widow's children could calculate. The Black Widow's children had minds that seemed impossible to explain. Dr. Warren had heard the story from a colleague, who had heard it from a patient, who had heard it from a neighbor. At first, he had dismissed it as rumor. But something about the story had nagged at him. Something had made him unable to let it go. And so he had made the journey to Marblehead. And now he sat across from 2 children who had just demonstrated abilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about the human mind. "Mrs. Carter," he said again, "I must know. How long have your children been able to do these things? And how is it possible?" Sarah Carter looked at her children. She looked at the doctor. She knew that whatever she said next would change their lives forever. "They've always been this way," she said. "Since before they could walk. Since before they could talk. They see things that other people cannot see. They understand things that other people cannot understand. I do not know why. I do not know how. I only know that it is true. Dr. Warren nodded slowly. He was already composing the letter he would write to his colleagues at Harvard. He was already imagining the examinations he would conduct, the papers he would publish, the lectures he would deliver. He did not notice the fear in Sarah Carter's eyes. He did not understand that he was about to make her children visible in a world that punished black people for being seen. The news of the Carter twins spread faster than Sarah had feared. Within a week of Dr. Warren's visit, 3 more doctors had come to Marblehead to examine the children. Within 2 weeks, a reporter from the Boston Evening Transcript had arrived asking questions and taking notes. Within a month, the story had appeared in newspapers across New England. The headlines varied in their tone. The Boston Evening Transcript ran a story titled "Remarkable Negro Children Display Unusual Mental Faculties." The article was cautiously admiring, describing the twins' abilities in detail while carefully avoiding any suggestion that these abilities might indicate equality between the races. The Springfield Republican published a different angle. Their headline read, "Scientific Mystery. How can such minds exist in such bodies?" The article treated the twins as curiosities, specimens to be studied rather than children to be admired. The Providence Journal went further. Their article, titled "Nature's Impossibility Made Manifest," suggested that the twins' abilities must be the result of some unknown biological anomaly, a freak occurrence that could never be replicated, and that proved nothing about the general capacities of the Negro race. But there were other reactions, too. The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper published in Boston by William Lloyd Garrison, ran a front-page story about the twins. The headline was simple and direct: "Proof of Human Equality." The article argued that the Carter twins demonstrated what abolitionists had always claimed, that the mental differences between races were the result of circumstance and education, not of inherent biological inferiority. This article was the one that changed everything. William Lloyd Garrison was one of the most famous abolitionists in America. He had been publishing The Liberator since 1831, and his newspaper was read by anti-slavery activists across the country and around the world. When he wrote about the Carter twins, people paid attention. Donations began arriving at Sarah Carter's small house. Letters came from strangers who wanted to help. Offers of education arrived from schools and tutors who were willing to teach the children for free. Invitations came from churches and lecture halls that wanted the twins to appear before their congregations and audiences. But other things arrived, too. Threats came in the mail. Anonymous letters warned Sarah that her children would be harmed if they continued to attract attention. Rocks were thrown through the windows of her house at night. A dead cat was left on her doorstep with a note that said only, "Know your place." The people of Marblehead, who had lived alongside Sarah Carter for years, began to treat her differently. Neighbors who had once been friendly now crossed the street to avoid her. Customers who had hired her for sewing and laundry work suddenly found other seamstresses. The white families who had employed her as a domestic servant let her go one by one until she had no income at all. Sarah understood what was happening. Her children's intelligence had upset the natural order of things. White people in Marblehead had been willing to tolerate a black family living among them, as long as that family remained inferior, dependent, subservient. But the twins' abilities suggested something that white people could not accept: the possibility that black minds were equal to white minds. This possibility was more threatening than any physical danger. It undermined the entire justification for slavery. It challenged the entire structure of American society. It made white people question things they had been taught since birth, and so they responded the only way they knew how. They tried to destroy what they could not understand. In November of 1862, Sarah Carter made a decision that broke her heart. She sent her children away. Dr. Warren had arranged for the twins to be enrolled at the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. This school had been founded in 1837 by a Quaker named Richard Humphreys, and it was one of the few institutions in America that provided advanced education to black students. The school had agreed to accept Elijah and Ruth on full scholarship with room and board, provided by a wealthy abolitionist family. Sarah could not go with them. She had no money for the journey. She had no means of supporting herself in Philadelphia, and she knew that if she left Marblehead, she would lose everything she had built over the past decade. The small house she rented, the few possessions she owned, the fragile stability that she had fought so hard to achieve. So she said goodbye to her children on a cold November morning at the Marblehead harbor. She held them both against her chest and told them things that she had never said before. "You are special," she whispered, "not because of what you can do with your minds. You are special because you are my children, because you are good and kind and strong, because you have survived in a world that did not want you to survive." She pulled back and looked at their faces, memorizing every detail. "The world will try to use you," she said. "White people will want to parade you before audiences. They will want to study you like animals. They will want to prove their theories about race one way or another using your minds as evidence." She took their hands in hers. "Do not let them," she said. "You are not evidence. You are not specimens. You are not proof of anything except your own existence. You are human beings. You deserve to be treated as human beings, and anyone who treats you as anything less does not deserve your cooperation." That Elijah and Ruth boarded the ship that would take them to Philadelphia. They stood at the railing and watched their mother grow smaller and smaller until she disappeared entirely. They did not cry. They had learned in their 8 years of life that crying did not change anything. They simply watched and remembered. The Institute for Colored Youth was located on Lombard Street in Philadelphia, in a neighborhood that had been home to free black people for generations. The school occupied a 3-story brick building that had once been a warehouse. Inside, classrooms had been carved out of the open spaces, furnished with donated desks and chairs, lined with shelves of books that had been collected over decades of operation. When Elijah and Ruth arrived in December of 1862, the school had approximately 120 students ranging in age from 6 to 22. Most of the students were the children of free black families who had lived in Philadelphia for years. A few were escaped slaves who had made their way north through the Underground Railroad. All of them were there for the same reason: to receive an education that the white world did not want them to have. The principal of the school was a man named Ebenezer Bassett. He was 38 years old, a graduate of Connecticut State Normal School, one of the first black Americans to receive a college education. He'd been leading the Institute for Colored Youth since 1857, and under his guidance, the school had become one of the finest educational institutions for black students in the country. When Mr. Bassett first met the Carter twins, he did what Dr. Warren had done. He tested them. But his tests were different. He did not care about calculations or memory tricks. He cared about understanding. He sat with the twins in his office and asked them questions. Not mathematical questions. Not reading questions. Questions about the world. "Why do you think there is a war happening in this country?" he asked. Elijah and Ruth looked at each other. They had learned over the years to communicate without speaking. A glance between them could convey entire conversations. Ruth answered first. "Because people believe things that are not true," she said. "They believe that some people are worth more than other people. They believe that the color of someone's skin tells you something about the content of their mind. They believe these things because believing them makes it easier to do terrible things without feeling guilty." She paused. "The war is about slavery," she continued. "But slavery is about belief. If people stopped believing that black people were inferior, slavery could not exist. The war is really a war about what people believe." Mr. Bassett sat back in his chair. He had been teaching for nearly a decade. He had encountered many intelligent students, but he had never heard an 8-year-old speak with such clarity about such complex matters. "And you, Elijah?" he asked. "What do you think?" Elijah considered the question carefully before answering. "I think my sister is right," he said. "But I think there is something else too. I think the war is also about money. The people who own slaves are rich because they do not have to pay for labor. If slavery ends, they will lose their money, and people will do almost anything to keep their money." He looked at Mr. Bassett with those intense dark eyes. "I think the war will not end until one side has no money left to fight," he said. "And I think many people will die before that happens." Mr. Bassett nodded slowly. He understood now why Dr. Warren had been so astonished. These children did not just have powerful minds. They had powerful understanding. They could see the world with a clarity that most adults never achieved. But he also understood something that Dr. Warren had not understood. These children were in danger. Their intelligence made them valuable to people who wanted to use them. Their intelligence also made them threatening to people who wanted to maintain the existing order. They would be sought after and hunted. They would be celebrated and despised. They would never be allowed to simply live their lives in peace. Mr. Bassett made a decision in that moment. He would protect these children. He would educate them. He would prepare them for the world they would face. But he would also teach them something that no one else could teach them. He would teach them how to survive. The years at the Institute for Colored Youth were transformative for Elijah and Ruth. They studied mathematics with a teacher named Octavius Caddo, a young black man who would later become one of the most important civil rights activists in Philadelphia's history. They studied literature with a woman named Fannie Jackson, who would eventually become the first black woman to lead an institution of higher education in America. They studied science, history, languages, and philosophy with teachers who were among the finest black educators of their generation. But more importantly, they learned to control their gifts. Mr. Bassett understood that raw intelligence displayed without wisdom could be dangerous. He had seen bright young black men and women destroyed by white jealousy, their talents making them targets rather than assets. He knew that Elijah and Ruth would need more than intellectual ability to survive. They would need judgment. They would need restraint. They would need the wisdom to know when to reveal their abilities and when to hide them. He taught them these lessons through careful instruction. "Your minds are like weapons," he told them one evening in his office. "A weapon that is always visible invites attack. A weapon that is hidden can be used when the time is right." He leaned forward in his chair. "There will be moments when you must show what you can do. There will be moments when powerful people need to see your abilities. But there will also be moments when showing your abilities will only bring you harm. You must learn to recognize the difference." The twins listened carefully. They had already begun to understand this lesson through their own experience. They had seen how their intelligence had destroyed their mother's life in Marblehead. They had seen how white people reacted when confronted with black minds that exceeded their own. They practiced hiding in plain sight. They learned to give answers that were correct, but not too correct. They learned to display knowledge that was impressive, but not threatening. They learned to read the reactions of white people and adjust their behavior accordingly. It was exhausting. It was degrading. It was necessary. Meanwhile, the war continued. In January of 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in Confederate states were free. The news spread through Philadelphia's black community like wildfire. People celebrated in the streets. Churches held services of thanksgiving. For the first time in American history, the federal government had declared that slavery was wrong. But the celebration was tempered by reality. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in states that were in rebellion. It did not free slaves in border states that had remained in the Union. It did not grant citizenship to freed slaves. It did not give black people the right to vote. And it did not end the war. The fighting continued through 1863 and into 1864. The battles grew larger and more terrible. Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Chickamauga. The names became synonymous with death on a scale that Americans had never experienced. Elijah followed the war with obsessive attention. He collected newspapers and created maps showing the positions of armies. He calculated casualty figures and supply logistics. He predicted the outcomes of battles based on the information available to him. His predictions were remarkably accurate. In March of 1864, when he was 10 years old, he wrote a letter to a military officer named Colonel Robert Goodshaw, who had commanded the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first black regiments in the Union Army. Colonel Shaw had been killed at the Battle of Fort Wagner in July of 1863, but Elijah did not know this when he wrote the letter. The letter was returned to the Institute with a note explaining that Colonel Shaw was dead. But someone had read Elijah's letter before returning it, and that someone had been impressed enough to share it with others. The letter contained Elijah's analysis of the war. He argued that the Union would win, but only if it adopted specific strategies. He suggested that the Union should focus on cutting Confederate supply lines rather than capturing territory. He recommended that black soldiers should be used more extensively, not just for their numbers, but for their motivation. He predicted that the war would end sometime in 1865 if these strategies were followed. The letter eventually found its way to a newspaper editor in Boston who had known Colonel Shaw. The editor published it under the headline, "A Child's Wisdom on the War." The article noted that the letter had been written by a 10-year-old black boy at the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. Once again, the Carter twins were in the newspapers, and once again trouble followed. In April of 1864, a group of white men came to the Institute for Colored Youth. There were 5 of them. They wore expensive suits and spoke with Southern accents. They said they were businessmen from Maryland, a border state where slavery remained legal. They said they had heard about the remarkable Negro children and wanted to see them for themselves. Mr. Bassett met them at the door of the school. He did not like what he saw. These men had the look of slave catchers, the men who made their living hunting down escaped slaves and returning them to bondage. "The children you are asking about are not escaped slaves, Mr. Bassett said. They were born free in Massachusetts. They are here legally under my protection with the full support of this institution." The leader of the group, a tall man with a gray beard and cold eyes, smiled without warmth. "We are not suggesting otherwise," he said. "We simply wish to meet these children. We have heard so much about them. Surely a brief visit would cause no harm." Mr. Bassett stood firm. "The children are not available for visits," he said. "They are students at this school. Their education is my responsibility, and I do not believe that your interest in them is academic." The men exchanged glances. Something passed between them, a silent communication that Mr. Bassett did not like. "Very well," the leader said. "Perhaps we will return another time." They left without further incident. But Mr. Bassett knew they would be back. That night he called Elijah and Ruth to his office. "Do you know who those men were?" he asked. The twins looked at each other. Ruth spoke first. "They were not businessmen," she said. "They were looking at us the way buyers look at merchandise. They want something from us, something specific." Elijah nodded in agreement. "They were also lying about being from Maryland," he added. "Their accents were wrong. One of them slipped and used a phrase that is common in South Carolina, but not in Maryland. I think they were from further south." Mr. Bassett was not surprised by their observations. He had learned to trust their perceptions. "I think they may try to take you," he said. "I do not know for certain, but I believe they see you as valuable property. Children with minds like yours would be worth a great deal of money to certain people. Scientists who want to study you, circus owners who want to display you, or worse." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I am going to send you somewhere safe," he said. "There is a community in Ohio near a town called Oberlin. It is a stronghold of abolitionist sentiment. The college there has been admitting black students for decades. There is a network of people who protect escaped slaves and free black people who are in danger. You will be safe there." The twins did not argue. They understood the danger. They understood that their minds, which should have been their greatest asset, had become a liability in a world that was not ready to accept black intelligence. 2 days later, they boarded a train heading west. They did not know it yet, but they would not return to Philadelphia for many years. They would not see Mr. Bassett again, and the men in expensive suits would not stop looking for them. The journey to Ohio took 4 days. The twins traveled with a woman named Harriet Tubman. This was not the famous Harriet Tubman who had led hundreds of slaves to freedom through the Underground Railroad. This was a different woman who used the same name, a common practice among black people who worked in the Freedom Network. Using famous names provided cover and confusion. It made it harder for slave catchers to track specific individuals. The woman who traveled with Elijah and Ruth was 40 years old, with strong hands and watchful eyes. She did not speak much during the journey. She watched. She listened. She made sure that no one was following them. They traveled by train when it was safe and by wagon when it was not. They stayed in houses that displayed certain signs in their windows, signs that indicated safe harbor for black travelers. They ate meals prepared by strangers who asked no questions and expected no thanks. On the 3rd night, while they were staying in a farmhouse in western Pennsylvania, the woman called Harriet sat down with the twins and told them things they needed to know. "You are being hunted," she said. "Not just by those men who came to your school. There are others, people who have heard about your abilities, people who want to use you for their own purposes." She looked at them with eyes that had seen too much. "Some of them want to study you. They think your minds can teach them something about race and intelligence. They want to cut you open and look at your brains. They want to measure your skulls and weigh your organs. They do not see you as children. They see you as specimens." Ruth felt a chill run through her body. She had known that people looked at her differently. She had not known that some of them wanted to dissect her. "Others want to display you," Harriet continued. "They want to put you on stages and charge money for people to see the Negro children who can think. They would dress you in fine clothes and teach you tricks and parade you before audiences like trained animals. They would make you famous and make themselves rich. Elijah clenched his fists. He had always known that his mind was different. He had not known that his mind could be bought and sold like cotton or tobacco. And there are some, Harriet said, her voice dropping lower, who want to destroy you. They believe that your existence threatens everything they hold dear. They believe that if people see what you can do, if people believe that black minds can equal white minds, then the entire system of slavery and segregation will collapse. They would rather see you dead than see you prove them wrong. She leaned forward and took their hands. "This is the world you live in," she said. "This is the world you will have to survive. I am sorry. I wish I could tell you it will get better, but I cannot promise that. All I can promise is that there are people who will help you, people who believe in freedom, people who will fight for you even when you cannot fight for yourselves." She released their hands and stood up. "Tomorrow we reach Ohio," she said. "You will be safe there, but you must remember what I have told you. You must never forget that you are hunted, and you must never stop running." The twins did not sleep that night. They lay in their beds and stared at the ceiling and thought about everything Harriet had said. They thought about their mother, alone in Marblehead, not knowing where her children were or whether they were safe. They thought about Mr. Bassett, who had protected them and taught them, and then sent them away to protect them further. They thought about the men in expensive suits who wanted to take them, and they thought about the future, the long, uncertain, dangerous future that stretched before them like an uncharted road. They were 10 years old. They had already lived through more than most people experienced in a lifetime, and they understood, in a way that no child should have to understand, that their lives would never be easy. Their gifts would never be fully appreciated. Their minds would always be seen as anomalies, exceptions, impossibilities. But they also understood something else. They understood that they had each other. They had been born together, had grown together, had developed their extraordinary abilities together. Their minds worked differently when they were together than when they were apart. They could communicate without words. They could solve problems by dividing them between their two perspectives. They could protect each other in ways that no one else could. This was their secret, not their intelligence, not their memory, not their ability to calculate or read or understand. Their secret was their bond, and as long as they had that bond, they would survive. Part 2. Oberlin, Ohio, was unlike any place Elijah and Ruth had ever seen. The town had been founded in 1833 by Presbyterian ministers who believed in racial equality as a Christian duty. From its earliest days, Oberlin had welcomed black residents, black students, and escaped slaves seeking freedom. The college at the center of town had been the first in America to regularly admit black students and women alongside white men. By 1864, when the Carter twins arrived, Oberlin had become the most racially integrated community in the United States. The twins were placed with a family named the Langstons. John Mercer Langston was a black lawyer who had been educated at Oberlin College and had become one of the most prominent black leaders in Ohio. His wife, Caroline, was a teacher who ran a small school for black children in their home. They had 3 children of their own, and they welcomed Elijah and Ruth as if they were family. For the first time since leaving Marblehead, the twins felt something close to safety. But safety, they would learn, was always temporary. The first months in Oberlin were focused on education. The twins were enrolled at the preparatory department of Oberlin College, where students as young as 10 could begin studies that would eventually lead to college admission. The curriculum was rigorous, designed to prepare students for the same education that white students received at Harvard or Yale. For most students, this curriculum was challenging. For Elijah and Ruth, it was not challenging enough. Within weeks, their teachers recognized what Dr. Warren and Mr. Bassett had recognized before them. These children were not ordinary students. Their minds operated on a different level entirely. They absorbed information at a rate that seemed impossible. They made connections between subjects that their teachers had never considered. They asked questions that revealed understanding far beyond their years. The head of the preparatory department, a stern New England woman named Professor Mary Jane Patterson, called the twins to her office after their first month of classes. Professor Patterson was herself a remarkable person. She had been born free in North Carolina and had moved to Ohio as a child. In 1862, she had become the first black woman in American history to earn a bachelor's degree, graduating from Oberlin College with honors. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to be a black person with an exceptional mind in a world that did not want to acknowledge black excellence. She sat behind her desk and studied the twins with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Your teachers have reported to me about your progress," she said. "They are astonished. They have never encountered students like you. They do not know what to do with you." The twins sat quietly, waiting for her to continue. "I have seen your examination results," Professor Patterson continued. "You have mastered material that is designed for students twice your age. You have done this in a matter of weeks. If you continue at this pace, you will exhaust our entire curriculum within a year or two." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "This creates a problem," she said. "Not for you, for us. We do not have the resources to educate minds like yours. We do not have teachers who can challenge you sufficiently. We do not have textbooks advanced enough to hold your interest." Ruth spoke first. "What do you suggest we do?" Professor Patterson smiled slightly. It was a rare expression on her stern face. "I suggest that we stop treating you as students," she said. "I suggest that we start treating you as colleagues." This was an unusual arrangement, perhaps unprecedented, but Professor Patterson had the authority to implement it, and she did. Beginning in their second month at Oberlin, Elijah and Ruth were no longer simply students. They attended classes when they chose to, but they were also given access to the college library, where they could pursue whatever subjects interested them. They were invited to attend lectures meant for college students. They were encouraged to conduct their own research and to share their findings with faculty members who were working on similar questions. Elijah gravitated toward mathematics and military strategy. He spent hours in the library reading about the campaigns of Napoleon, the tactics of ancient generals, the principles of logistics and supply. He applied his mathematical mind to the problems of warfare, developing theories about optimal troop movements and resource allocation that his professors found remarkable. Ruth gravitated toward languages and history. She taught herself Greek and Hebrew, in addition to the Latin she had begun to learn. She read primary sources in their original languages, discovering nuances that translations had missed. She developed a particular interest in the history of slavery, tracing its roots back through ancient civilizations, understanding how human bondage had evolved over millennia. Together, they began to see the world in ways that most people never would. But even in Oberlin, even surrounded by people who supported them, the twins could not escape the reality of their situation. The men who had come to Philadelphia did not give up their search. In March of 1865, 3 months before the end of the Civil War. A stranger arrived in Oberlin asking questions. He was a white man in his 40s, well-dressed with a polished manner that suggested education and wealth. He said his name was Dr. Samuel Morton, and that he was a scientist from Philadelphia, conducting research on human intelligence. He said he had heard about 2 exceptional Negro children who were studying at Oberlin, and he wished to meet them for academic purposes. Dr. Morton was not who he claimed to be, the real doctor. Samuel Morton had been a physician in Philadelphia who had spent decades collecting human skulls and measuring them to prove that white people had larger brains than black people. His work had been used to justify slavery and racial discrimination. He had died in 1851, 14 years before this stranger arrived in Oberlin claiming his name. John Mercer Langston was the first to recognize the deception. As a lawyer, he had learned to research people who made claims, and he discovered quickly that Dr. Samuel Morton was dead. He confronted the stranger at his hotel. "I do not know who you are," Langston said, "but I know who you are not. You are not Dr. Morton. Dr. Morton died 14 years ago, and I know what you want. You want the Carter children. You will not have them." The stranger's polished manner disappeared. His face twisted into something ugly. "Those children are valuable," he said. "More valuable than you can imagine. There are people who will pay a great deal of money for minds like theirs, and there are other people who will pay a great deal of money to make sure minds theirs are never seen again." He stepped closer to Langston, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You cannot protect them forever," he said. "Sooner or later they will leave Oberlin. Sooner or later they will be vulnerable. And when that happens, we will be waiting." He turned and walked away, leaving Langston standing in the hotel lobby with a cold fear in his heart. That night Langston gathered the twins and told them everything. He did not soften the truth or try to protect them from the danger. He believed they deserved to know what they faced. Ruth listened with a calm expression that masked her churning emotions. "Who are these people?" she asked. "Who is paying them?" Langston shook his head. "I do not know for certain, but I have suspicions. There are wealthy men in the South who have made fortunes from slavery. The war is going badly for them. They know they are going to lose. They know that slavery will end, and they are looking for ways to prove that even without chains, black people will remain inferior." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Children like you are a threat to that belief," he said. "If you exist, if you can do what you do, then everything they believe is wrong. Some of them want to study you to find some explanation that preserves their worldview. Others want to destroy you before you can prove them wrong." Elijah had been silent throughout this conversation. Now he spoke, his voice steady despite the fear he felt. "What can we do?" he asked. Langston looked at him with respect. This child, this 11-year-old boy, was asking not how to hide but how to fight. "For now, you can continue your studies," Langston said. "You can continue to develop your minds. Knowledge is power, and the more you know, the more powerful you become. But you must also be careful. You must not draw unnecessary attention to yourselves, and you must be ready to move at a moment's notice if the danger becomes too great." The twins nodded. They understood. They had been running since they were 8 years old. They would continue to run for as long as necessary. But someday they knew running would not be enough. Someday they would have to stand and fight. The Civil War ended on April 9, 1865, when General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The news reached Oberlin 3 days later. Church bells rang throughout the town. People poured into the streets celebrating, weeping, embracing strangers. After 4 years of bloodshed, After more than 600,000 deaths, the war was finally over. The Union had been preserved. Slavery had been destroyed. But the celebration was short-lived. 5 days after Lee's surrender, on April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He died the following morning without regaining consciousness. The news of Lincoln's death cast a shadow over everything. The man who had guided the nation through its darkest hour, who had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, who had promised to bind up the nation's wounds, was gone. In his place stood Andrew Johnson, a man from Tennessee whose commitment to black equality was uncertain at best. Ruth understood immediately what Lincoln's death meant for people like her and Elijah. She was 11 years old now, and her understanding of history and politics had grown sophisticated. She had studied the patterns of power throughout human civilization. She had seen how progress could be reversed, how freedom could be taken away, how the powerful always found ways to maintain their dominance. Lincoln was the only thing protecting us, she said to Elijah on the night they learned of the assassination. Without him, everything changes. Elijah had been thinking the same thing. His study of military strategy had taught him that winning a war was only the beginning. Holding the peace was often harder than winning the victory. The people who hunted us before will be stronger now, he said. They will have allies in the government. They will have time to rebuild their power, and they will not forget about us. He was right. The years following the war, known as Reconstruction, were a time of hope and horror for Black Americans. On one hand, Congress passed constitutional amendments that formally abolished slavery, granted citizenship to Black people, and guaranteed voting rights regardless of race. Black men were elected to Congress. Black communities built schools and churches. For a brief moment, it seemed like true equality might be possible. On the other hand, violence against Black people increased dramatically. White supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan emerged across the South, terrorizing Black families and murdering Black leaders. Laws were passed to restrict Black freedom in everything but name. The promise of Reconstruction was betrayed almost as soon as it was made. Elijah and Ruth watched these developments with growing concern. They were teenagers now, their minds sharper than ever, their understanding of the world deeper than most adults would ever achieve. And they understood that the fight for Black equality was far from over. It had barely begun. In 1868, when the twins were 14 years old, they made a decision that would shape the rest of their lives. They decided to use their gifts in service of their people. The decision came after a long conversation with John Mercer Langston, who had become like a father to them. Langston had recently been appointed as the first dean of the law department at Howard University in Washington, D.C. He was preparing to move his family to the nation's capital, and he wanted the twins to come with him. Howard University had been founded in 1867 to provide higher education for Black Americans. It was named after General Oliver Otis Howard, who had led the Freedmen's Bureau and had committed his life to helping formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. The university was small and underfunded, but it represented something important, a commitment to Black intellectual development at the highest level. Langston believed that the twins belonged at Howard, not as students, but as teachers. "You have learned everything Oberlin can teach you," he said. "You have read more books than most professors. Your minds are ready for work that matters. And Howard needs people like you." Ruth hesitated. She was only 14. How could she teach adults who were twice her age? Langston smiled. He had anticipated this objection. "You will not teach classes in the traditional sense," he said. "You will work as researchers. You will help faculty members with their projects. You will write papers that will be published under other names. Your contributions will be hidden, but they will be real." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "This is how power works," he said, "not through public recognition, but through quiet influence. You will shape the thinking of the people who shape the world. You will plant seeds that will grow into forests, and no one will ever know that the seeds came from you." The twins understood what he was offering. It was not fame or glory. It was something more valuable. It was purpose. They agreed to go to Washington. But before they left Oberlin, they received news that changed everything. Their mother was dying. Sarah Carter had never recovered from the loss of her children. After they left Marblehead, she had descended into poverty and despair. The white community that had shunned her continued to shun her. The few black families in the area did what they could to help, but resources were limited. She had developed consumption, the disease that would later be called tuberculosis. By the time word reached Oberlin, she had been sick for months. The doctors said she had weeks to live, perhaps less. The twins faced an impossible choice. Going to Marblehead meant exposing themselves to the people who had been hunting them for years. The men who wanted to capture them, study them, or destroy them were still out there. Returning to Massachusetts would put them in danger. But their mother was dying. She was alone. She had sacrificed everything for them. Could they let her die without seeing her one last time? They did not hesitate. They boarded a train heading east. The journey to Marblehead took 3 days. The twins traveled under assumed names, wearing plain clothes that made them look like ordinary black children. They avoided eye contact with white passengers. They spoke as little as possible. They made themselves invisible. But invisibility has limits. On the second day of the journey, as the train passed through Pennsylvania, Elijah noticed a man watching them from across the car. The man was white, middle-aged, with the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. He wore the clothes of a farmer or laborer, but his eyes were too sharp, too calculating. He was not what he appeared to be. Elijah leaned close to Ruth and whispered, without moving his lips, "We are being watched." The man in the brown coat by the window. Ruth did not turn her head. She'd already noticed the man. She had been tracking his movements since he boarded the train at the last station. "I know," she whispered back. "There is another one at the front of the car. They are working together." Elijah's mind raced through possibilities. They could get off at the next station, but that would only delay the confrontation. They could try to hide in the crowd, but there was no crowd on this rural stretch of railroad. They could fight, but they were 2 teenagers against grown men, probably armed. "The train is slowing down," Ruth said. "We will reach a station in approximately 3 minutes. When the doors open, we run." Elijah nodded almost imperceptibly. It was not a good plan, but it was the only plan they had. The next 3 minutes felt like hours. The train decelerated gradually, the landscape outside the windows changing from forest to farmland to the outskirts of a small town. The man in the brown coat stood up casually and began moving toward the twins' end of the car. The man at the front did the same. They were closing in. The train stopped. The doors opened. Elijah and Ruth exploded into motion. They had always been fast runners, their young bodies lean and strong from years of activity. They burst through the door and onto the platform, weaving through the crowd of passengers waiting to board. Behind them, they heard shouts of surprise and anger as the 2 men tried to follow. The twins did not look back. They ran through the station, past the ticket counter, out onto the main street of the town. They had no idea where they were. They had no idea where to go. They simply ran. A hand reached out and grabbed Ruth's arm. She spun around, ready to fight, ready to scream. But the hand belonged to a black woman. She was old, perhaps 60, with gray hair and kind eyes. She wore the simple dress of a domestic servant, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "This way," the woman said, "quickly, before they see you." There was no time to question. The twins followed the woman down an alley, through a gate, into a small yard behind a house. The woman opened a cellar door and gestured for them to descend. They climbed down into darkness. The door closed above them. They heard the woman's footsteps moving away. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the cellar door opened again. The old woman climbed down, carrying a lantern. "You are safe for now," she said. "Those men searched the station, but they did not find you. They have boarded another train heading further east. They think you are still running." Ruth found her voice. "Who are you? How did you know to help us?" The woman smiled. "My name is Patience. I work for the family that owns this house. And I knew to help you because I was told to watch for 2 children who might need protection." "A message came last week from a man named Langston. He said you might be passing through. He said to keep you safe." The twins looked at each other. Even from Ohio, John Mercer Langston was protecting them. He had anticipated the danger. He had arranged help along their route. They were not alone. They spent 2 days hiding in Patience's cellar. She brought them food and water, news and information. She told them that the men who had been following them were still in the area, asking questions, offering rewards for information about 2 black children traveling together. But she also told them something else. She told them that their mother was still alive. Sarah Carter had defied the doctor's predictions. She was clinging to life, refusing to die until she saw her children one more time. She knew they were coming. She had felt it somehow, in the way that mothers sometimes feel things they cannot explain. On the 3rd day, Patience arranged for a wagon to take the twins the final miles to Marblehead. They traveled at night, hidden under blankets in the back of the wagon. The driver was a black man who asked no questions and offered no conversation. They arrived at their mother's house just before dawn. The house was smaller than Ruth remembered. The paint was peeling. The windows were cracked. The garden that their mother had once kept so carefully was overgrown with weeds. But the door was open, and a candle was burning in the window. They went inside. Sarah Carter lay on a narrow bed in the corner of the main room. She was thin, terribly thin. Her skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent. Her hair had gone gray. Her eyes were closed. But when she heard her children's footsteps, those eyes opened. And despite everything, despite the illness and the poverty, and the years of separation, she smiled. "You came," she whispered. "I knew you would come." The twins knelt beside her bed. They took her hands, one on each side, and for the first time in 6 years, they were a family again. Sarah lived for 3 more days. In those 3 days, she told her children everything she had never been able to tell them before. She told them about her own childhood, about her parents, about the history of their family stretching back generations. She told them about the father they had never known, a sailor who had died at sea before they were born. She told them about the night they were born, how she had held them in her arms and known immediately that they were special. And she told them what she wanted them to do with their lives. "Do not hide," she said, her voice weak but clear. "I told you to hide when you were children. I told you to pretend to be ordinary. I was trying to protect you, but I was wrong." She gripped their hands with surprising strength. "You cannot hide what you are," she said. "You cannot pretend to be less than you are." The world will always try to make you smaller, to put you in boxes, to tell you what you cannot do. But you must not listen. You must stand tall. You must let them see what you are. You must show them what black people can become when they are given the chance. She took a shuddering breath. I will not see it, she said. I will not see what you will become, but I know it will be magnificent. I know you will change the world, and I know that somewhere, somehow, I will be watching. She died on the morning of the 4th day with her children holding her hands. They buried her in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Marblehead. The grave was unmarked. There was no minister, no ceremony. No one present except the twins and the undertaker who had agreed to help. But as they stood by the grave, Ruth spoke words that their mother would have wanted to hear. We will not hide, Ruth said. We will not pretend. We will show the world what you always knew we could be, and we will make you proud. Elijah added his own promise. We will fight, he said. Not with weapons, not with violence, but with our minds. We will prove that everything they believe about us is wrong. We will tear down their lies with truth, and we will never, ever give up. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then they turned and walked away from the grave, away from Marblehead, away from the life they had known as children. They were 14 years old. They were orphans, and they were ready to change the world. The twins arrived in Washington, D.C., in the autumn of 1868. The nation's capital was a city of contradictions. The great buildings of government stood alongside neighborhoods of desperate poverty. White politicians debated the future of black Americans in marble chambers, while black families struggled to survive just blocks away. Freedom had been declared, but equality remained a distant dream. Howard University was located on a hill overlooking the city. The campus was small, just a few buildings surrounded by muddy fields. But what it lacked in physical grandeur, it made up for in ambition. The twins began their work immediately. They were officially enrolled as students, but this was a formality. In reality, they worked alongside the faculty, contributing to research projects that would shape the future of black education. Elijah focused on mathematics and economics, developing theories about how black communities could build wealth despite systemic discrimination. Ruth focused on history and law, documenting the crimes of slavery and building legal arguments for reparations and equal rights. Their contributions were hidden, as Langston had promised. Papers were published under the names of professors. Speeches were delivered by others. The twins remained in the shadows, their influence invisible but powerful. But shadows can only hide so much. In 1871, when the twins were 17, Ruth wrote a legal brief that argued for federal protection of black voting rights. The brief was technically authored by a Howard professor, but the arguments were entirely Ruth's. The brief was used by Republican members of Congress to support what became known as the Enforcement Acts, a series of laws designed to combat the Ku Klux Klan and protect black voters in the South. The laws passed. The Klan was temporarily suppressed. Black men voted in record numbers in the elections of 1872, but someone noticed. A journalist from a Southern newspaper had been investigating the origins of the legal arguments used to pass the Enforcement Acts. He traced the brief back to Howard University. He discovered that the credited author, the professor, had not actually written the document. He dug deeper, and he found the twins. The article appeared in December of 1872 under the headline, "Negro Children Control Congress." The story was sensationalized, exaggerated, and filled with racist assumptions. But at its core was a true revelation. Two black teenagers had been secretly shaping federal policy for years. Their minds had produced work that changed laws and influenced elections. Their intelligence had penetrated the highest levels of government. The reaction was immediate and violent. Congress launched an investigation. Howard University was threatened with loss of federal funding. Death threats flooded in from across the country. A group of men attempted to set fire to the building where the twins lived. But something else happened, too. Black newspapers across the country celebrated the twins as heroes. Churches read their names from pulpits. Parents told their children about Elijah and Ruth Carter, the proof that black minds were equal to any minds on earth. The twins became symbols of everything that black Americans could achieve if given the chance. They had spent their entire lives hiding. Now, finally, they stepped into the light. In January of 1873, Elijah and Ruth Carter gave their first public speech at the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. The church was packed. People stood in the aisles, sat on windowsills, crowded outside trying to hear through the open doors. The twins walked to the front of the sanctuary and looked out at the sea of black faces, waiting to hear what they had to say. Ruth spoke first. "They told us we could not think," she said. "They told us our minds were inferior. They told us that slavery was justified because we were less than human. They told us these things because they wanted to believe them, because believing them made it easier to do evil." She paused, letting her words settle. "We are the proof that they were wrong. Not because we are special, not because we are different from other black people. We are the proof because we were given a chance to learn, a chance to develop our minds, a chance to become what we were always capable of becoming." She gestured to the crowd. "Every person in this room has the same capacity. Every black child in America has the same potential. The only difference is opportunity, and that is what we must fight for. Not just freedom, not just equality under the law, but opportunity, the chance for every black child to discover what their mind can do." Elijah spoke next. "Our mother told us something before she died," he said. "She told us not to hide. She told us to let the world see what we are. She told us that the world will always try to make us smaller, but we must not listen." He looked out at the faces watching him, faces filled with hope and pain and determination. "We have been fighting this battle for our entire lives," he said. "We will continue fighting it for as long as we live, but we cannot fight alone. Every one of you is a soldier in this war. Every one of you has a mind that can be sharpened, a voice that can be raised, a contribution that can be made." He raised his fist. "They want us to be silent. They want us to be invisible. They want us to accept our place at the bottom of society. But we will not be silent. We will not be invisible. We will not accept what they tell us we must accept." His voice rose to fill the church. "We are Elijah and Ruth Carter. We are black. We are gifted, and we are just the beginning." The church erupted in cheers. People wept openly. Strangers embraced each other. For a moment in that sacred space, the dream of equality felt possible. The twins stood together, holding hands as their mother had held theirs on her deathbed. They had come so far. From a small fishing village in Massachusetts, through fear and flight and loss, through years of hiding and years of work, to this moment, standing before their people, claiming their place in history. But their story was not over. It was just beginning. The following decades were filled with both triumph and tragedy. Elijah Carter became one of the most influential economists of his generation. He developed theories about wealth creation in oppressed communities that would not be fully appreciated until more than a century after his death. He advised black business owners, trained black accountants, and established investment funds that helped black families build generational wealth despite the obstacles placed in their way. Ruth Carter became a legal scholar, whose work laid the groundwork for civil rights arguments that would eventually reach the Supreme Court. She trained dozens of black lawyers. She wrote briefs that challenged segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement. She never argued a case in court herself. Women were not permitted to do so, but her words were spoken by others in courtrooms across the country. Together, they founded schools, established newspapers, and built organizations that would continue their work long after they were gone. But they also faced defeats. Reconstruction ended in 1877, and with it ended the federal commitment to protecting black rights. The Ku Klux Klan resurged. Jim Crow laws spread across the South. The progress that had been made was systematically dismantled. The men who had hunted the twins never stopped hunting them. Over the years, there were assassination attempts, arson, threats against everyone they loved. They learned to live with danger as a constant companion. And there were personal losses. John Mercer Langston died in 1897, leaving a void that could never be filled. Friends and colleagues passed away. The community that had nurtured them grew smaller year by year. But they never stopped fighting. In 1910, when the twins were 56 years old, they gave their final public speech together at the inaugural conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP had been founded just a year earlier, building on the work that people like the Carters had been doing for decades. Ruth was frail now, her health damaged by years of relentless work. Elijah stood beside her, his hair white, but his eyes still sharp. "We have lived long enough to see great changes," Ruth said, her voice weaker, but still clear. "When we were born, slavery was the law of the land. When we die, we will leave behind a generation that has known nothing but freedom. That is progress." She paused to catch her breath. "But we have also lived long enough to see how easily progress can be reversed. How quickly freedom can be taken away. How persistent hatred can be." She looked out at the young faces in the audience, faces that would carry the struggle forward. "Do not be discouraged," she said. "Do not despair. The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. You may not live to see the victory. We will not live to see the victory. But the victory will come. It must come. Because truth is stronger than lies, and love is stronger than hate." Elijah spoke last. "Our mother told us when we were children that we must show the world what black people can become when they are given the chance. We have tried to do that. We have succeeded in some ways and failed in others. But we have never stopped trying." He took his sister's hand. "Now, the work passes to you. You must continue what we started. You must build on what we built. You must never give up. Never surrender. Never accept the world as it is when it could be so much better." He looked at the audience one final time. "We are Elijah and Ruth Carter. We were told that our minds were impossible. We prove that nothing is impossible. And we pass that lesson to you, now and forever. Nothing is impossible." Ruth died 3 months later in the spring of 1910. Elijah followed her in the autumn of that same year. They were buried side by side in a cemetery in Washington, D.C., not far from the campus of Howard University. Their headstone bore a simple inscription: "Two minds, one purpose. Freedom." The story of the Carter twins faded from popular memory in the decades that followed. History books focused on other figures, other moments. Their contributions were absorbed into the larger narrative of the civil rights struggle, their individual names forgotten. But their legacy lived on. Every black child who received an education, every black lawyer who argued for justice, every black economist who built wealth for their community, every black family that rose from poverty through education and hard work, all of them were beneficiaries of what the Carter twins had started. And somewhere in the archives of Howard University, there are boxes of papers that have never been fully examined. Letters and documents that bear the handwriting of two children who should not have been able to write what they wrote. Evidence of minds that should not have existed according to the beliefs of their time. The twins' story proved something that should never have needed proving. It proves that intelligence is not determined by race, that potential is not limited by circumstance, that the human mind, given the chance to develop, can achieve things that seem impossible. It proves that two children born in poverty, hunted by hatred, orphaned by injustice, can still change the world. And it proves that the world, despite all evidence to the contrary, can change, not quickly, not easily, not without cost, but it can change. That is the lesson of Elijah and Ruth Carter. That is their gift to us. That is the secret they carried, the impossible secret that could not be explained. The secret was hope. The secret was resilience. The secret was love. And that secret, unlike the twins themselves, can never die. It lives on in every person who refuses to accept limits, in every child who dares to dream, in every mind that reaches for something greater than what the world says is possible. The Carter twins lit a flame in 1862. That flame still burns today, and it will keep burning as long as there are people willing to tend it, as long as there are people willing to believe.